My name is Ranger Daniel Mercer. For nearly 20 years, my boots carried me across the backcountry of Oregon, through places most people will never step foot in. I served on fire lines, search and rescue calls, and countless patrols where the only company was the sound of wind through endless trees. But no matter how far I've traveled, there's one forest I can never forget. Locals call it Echo Pines. It doesn't look like much on a map, just another sweep of evergreens among thousands of others in the Pacific Northwest. But ask anyone who grew up within earshot of those ridges, and you'll hear the same thing whispered. That's the forest that cries. The name came long before my time. The earliest logging crews in the late 1800s used to camp at the base of those slopes, and some never came back. I've read their accounts. Whole columns of newsprint filled with frantic testimony. A timber crew halts operations, claiming that they heard voices at night, screams carrying through the tree line, a woman's voice begging for help. Tough men with hands like stone, refusing to strike another tree because they swore the forest was alive with sound. Even in the old ranger station, there are leather-bound ledgers with pages still intact. Faded handwriting that tells the same story. Strange voices heard after sunset. Sound does not carry in natural ways. Personnel refuse to continue survey. Over and over, in different hands, across different decades, the same words. The screams in the pines. When I first took my post in that region, I didn't pay it much attention. You hear all kinds of tall tales in the woods. The mountain men say one thing, the old families say another, and the land itself seems to grow new legends with every passing season. But Echo Pines was different. It wasn't just a story told to keep children from wandering too far. It was something that kept entire communities awake at night. I'll tell you what it's like. Imagine standing on a ridge at dusk, the air cooling fast, the sky just beginning to fade. The forest is quiet in that way only deep wilderness can be. No cars, no voices, nothing mechanical. Then, faint at first, something threads its way through the silence. A sound. Too sharp to be the wind, too uneven to be an animal. A scream. Others swear it's a child crying for help, and a few say it wasn't a voice at all, but something that knew how to pretend. Something using sound like a hook, pulling you deeper, making sure you never find your way out. I've read the incident reports from families who camped out there, reporting entire nights where the air was filled with cries. Fathers admitting they packed up their tents in the dark, too shaken to wait for sunrise. Mothers saying they clutched their children until morning, certain that if they answered the screams, something would come crashing through the trees. You see, the forest doesn't just echo, it holds. Sounds bounce in ways they shouldn't. Cries don't fade with distance, they fold around you, as if the trees themselves are carrying them closer. More than once, I stood perfectly still and realized the screaming wasn't out there anymore. It was in me. Like the sound had pressed itself into my chest, vibrating in my ribs, waiting for me to breathe it back out. That's why the name stuck. Echo Pines. Because the sound doesn't leave when it should. It lingers. It follows. I've had to write my own reports on it, though I'll admit, I never wrote everything I wanted to. How do you explain in an official document that the screams seem to know your name? How do you tell an office full of professionals that in the dead of night, you heard your mother's voice calling to you from between the trees, even though she'd been dead for years? Still, there are traces of it hidden in the paperwork. Handwritten notes scrawled at the bottom of otherwise dry reports. Heard screams, source unknown, or simply, voices in the pines again. For over a century, the story hasn't changed. Different men, different years, same sounds. If this were just myth, it would have faded long ago. But it hasn't. It still grips the people who live on the edge of those woods. They still lock their windows when the wind carries too sharp at night. They still warn their children not to linger near the tree line. And now you're going to hear their words. The testimonies of those who stepped into Echo Pines and came back shaken, and the silence left behind by those who never returned at all. But before we go further, remember this. The world hides more than it reveals. And if you want to keep hearing stories that most won't... The first incident I want to tell you about didn't happen to me directly. It happened to a family who entered Echo Pines on a warm weekend in July of 1998. Their names were David and Karen Miller, with their 2 children, ages 9 and 11. They'd driven in from Portland, looking for a quiet campsite away from the crowded parks, closer to the city. The Millers checked in at the ranger station mid-afternoon. Nothing unusual, permits signed, map explained, fire restrictions reviewed. They seemed excited, eager for a weekend outdoors. There was nothing in their appearance, nothing in their tone of voice that suggested this trip would end any differently than 100 others. But before nightfall, they made a call. At 8:43 p.m., David Miller radioed in. His voice was calm at first, a little hesitant. He said they'd been hearing sounds in the woods, screams. At first faint, like echoes bouncing across the valley. They thought maybe another group was nearby, but as the minutes passed, the voices grew clearer, closer. He told the ranger on duty, "It doesn't sound like an animal. It sounds like people. But there's something wrong with it. It carries too far. It bends." That call was logged, routine. But 20 minutes later, a second transmission came through. This time his voice was different, shaken, clipped, as if he was speaking faster than his thoughts could keep up. He said the screams were changing, stretching into words. And then, the line went silent. The last words ever recorded from David Miller were these: "It's not an animal. It's copying us." That was the last anyone ever heard from the Millers. By the time rangers reached their designated campsite the next morning, the place was in disarray. The tents had been ripped apart, but not slashed by claws from the outside. Number. Every tear radiated outward, as though something had pressed against the canvas from within. As though whatever they were hiding from was already inside with them. Their gear was scattered, lanterns overturned, a cooler tipped into the dirt. But what chilled the responding officers most was the silence. No bodies, no footprints leading away. Just the faint scent of smoke where their campfire had burned itself to ash. The investigation drew. At first, it could be mistaken for the echo of his own, a trick of the forest. But it grows stronger, louder, until the family falls silent, realizing what they're hearing. The chilling part? The voice on the recording doesn't just sound like a stranger screaming. It sounds like David himself. His own voice, mimicking his tone, repeating fragments of his sentences seconds after he speaks them. Imagine listening to yourself echo back, not delayed, not distorted, but exact, as though something out there in the trees was practicing being you. The final moments of the tape are chaos. Karen's voice rising in panic, the children crying, David shouting, "Stay together, don't run!" And layered underneath it all, his own voice again, but doubled, tripled, surrounding them, repeating his commands with eerie precision. Then, static, nothing more. That tape is sealed now, kept in evidence by the county sheriff's office. Only a handful of us have ever heard it in full, and I can tell you, it is the kind of sound that stays with you long after silence returns. Officially, the Miller case remains open. The documents label it as unsolved disappearance. But in the margins of one ranger's log, I once saw a note written in a shaking hand. The forest spoke back. And this was not the last time Echo Pines would take a voice and turn it against us. Subscribe to MindFuel if you haven't already, because what comes next is even harder to accept. And yet, it's all there, buried in the records, whispered in the testimonies of those who risked telling the truth. The screams didn't stop with the Millers. They only grew louder. In the summer of 1983, long before the Miller family vanished, another record was written into the history of Echo Pines. This time, not by hikers, not by locals, but by one of our own. a ranger named Thomas Avery, assigned to a fire lookout tower that stood on the eastern ridge of the forest. That tower was meant to be his post for 3 months, a simple assignment. Watch the valley, scan for smoke, and radio in any signs of fire. Avery was experienced, steady-handed, and by all accounts, practical to the point of skepticism. If there was ever a man unlikely to get caught up in local folklore, it was him. But after his disappearance, investigators recovered fragments of his journal. The leather-bound notebook was scorched at the edges, some pages burned away entirely, but what survived still chills anyone who reads it. The entries begin innocently enough. Descriptions of the landscape, notes about shifts in wind, a sketch of the valley beneath him. But midway through July, the tone changes. One entry reads, "The wind carried something strange tonight. Not just rustling trees, a sound sharper than that, like a scream. At first I thought it was a mountain lion, but it didn't fade like an animal's call should. It stretched, drew itself thin until it seemed to come from everywhere at once." He goes on to write about how the sound only came at night, always after the forest had settled into complete silence. He noted how it would rise, cresting like a wave, then vanish the moment he unlatched the tower door to step outside, almost as though whatever was making it knew he was listening. Night after night, Avery described the same pattern, screams carried by the wind, always distant, always stopping when he moved to investigate. His words paint the picture of a man caught between logic and fear. Another entry. "The voices don't behave naturally. They don't travel like sound should. They hold steady, even as the air shifts direction. Sometimes I swear they're closer than they should be. But when I lean out, the forest is quiet. It's like the sound exists only inside the walls of this tower." Days passed. His handwriting grew jagged, less precise. His sentences shorter, broken. The final stretch of the journal reads like the unraveling. The fire had gutted it from within, burning hot enough to twist the steel bolts, but not a single trace of Avery's body was ever found. There were no remains in the ashes, no bones, nothing. As though he had walked out before the fire began, or as though the fire had consumed more than wood and flesh. His journal was discovered, buried in the dirt at the base of the tower, partially shielded from the flames. Investigators sealed it in evidence, but copies of its words still circulate among rangers today, passed quietly, like warnings too dangerous to speak aloud. Some say Avery set the fire himself, driven to desperation by what he heard. Others believe the fire was no accident, that whatever had entered that stairwell didn't want him to leave alive. The tower was never rebuilt, the ridge was abandoned, and on the official maps, that area of Echo Pines is marked only with a blank space where the tower once stood. But among those who knew him, one detail never faded. Avery was not a man who frightened easily. If he wrote that the screaming had left the forest and moved inside with him, then something had crossed a boundary that should never have been crossed. And that was only the beginning. Subscribe to MindFuel if you haven't already, because these aren't just stories of what the forest holds, but of what it lets slip through. And the voices of Echo Pines were far from finished. By the late 1990s, Echo Pines had already built its reputation among the locals as a place avoided after dark. But among outsiders, especially the curious, the reckless, and the ones chasing stories, it had become something else. A challenge, a dare. In the spring of 1999, a group of college students from Eugene decided to test the legend for themselves. 5 of them in total, 3 men, 2 women, armed with nothing more than camping gear, handheld cameras, and a stack of blank cassette tapes. Their plan was simple: spend 3 nights in Echo Pines, record every sound, and prove once and for all whether the stories were true. They were young, eager, the kind of group that laughed at warnings and treated fear like entertainment. Their first tapes show them smiling into the lens, joking about how the only thing they were likely to catch on film was each other snoring. But as the hours unfolded, the laughter thinned. On the second night, the recordings change. You hear the students gathered around a fire, their voices low, their mood uncertain. One of the women insists she heard something from the ridge, a cry that rose and fell like a siren. Another swears it wasn't just one voice, but several, overlapping. The tape picks up faint sounds in the distance, thin and jagged, riding the wind like glass breaking in slow motion. The students decide to test it. They scream into the night themselves, one after another, their voices sharp, echoing against the trees. They laugh nervously afterward, joking that they'd probably scared off any wildlife within miles. Hours later, on another reel, something impossible happens. The recorder picks up the same screams. Not similar, not close, the same. Each student's voice replayed exactly, in the same order, at the same pitch and volume. Only now, the sound isn't coming from their camp. It's drifting through the forest. Their voices return to them, stretched thin, as if the trees themselves had learned their tones and were giving them back. You can hear their fear turning real in the audio. The joking stops. The camera pans wildly in the surviving footage, searching the tree line as the voices move closer. At one point, a student whispers, "It's us. It's our voices. They're playing us back." The casing was cracked, the film warped with moisture, but some of the footage was recoverable. That's how we know what happened in those last hours. That's how we heard their voices chasing themselves through the dark. But we never found the students. No tents, no bones, no sign that they had ever left the forest. I remember the testimony of one ranger who joined the original search party. His words still haunt me. We never found the students, but we still hear them on windy nights. Their voices don't fade. It's like the forest is keeping them alive in sound, even though they're long gone. And if you stand on the ridge where that camera was found, sometimes, when the air is just right, you'll hear it too. Not echoes, not memories. The forest returning the screams of 5 students who thought the woods were only legend. And that's why these stories matter. Because they're not just tales of the past, they're warnings for the future. If you want more of these voices, the ones most refuse to hear, subscribe to MindFuel. Because Echo Pines still speaks, and the screams that began long ago have never stopped. The forest holds many stories, but few as unsettling as the one told by a man who was never meant to be remembered. He had no permanent address, no family willing to claim him, no place in society that anyone could point to and say he belonged here. He was a drifter, wandering from town to town, living off scraps, moving with the seasons. Yet for 6 long months, he claimed the woods were his home. When he first sat down to tell his story, his voice was cracked and unsteady, the sound of a man who'd spent too many nights without sleep. He looked worn, his clothes layered with dirt and smoke, but his eyes carried something far heavier, something hollow, as though he had seen more than a man should ever see. He began with a warning. "The forest doesn't stay still," he said, his voice low, almost as if afraid someone might overhear. "It doesn't just sit there and wait for you. It learns you. It figures out what scares you, and it uses that against you." According to him, the woods were not just a place of silence and shadow. They were alive in a way that went beyond roots and soil. He claimed the forest fed on people, but not in the way predators do, not with teeth or claws. Instead, it fed on fear. At first, he resisted. He told himself he was too hardened, too numb to give the woods what it wanted. He'd lived through storms, through hunger, through cold nights without shelter. He thought he could outlast whatever was out there. But the forest, he insisted, had a way of pushing. If you didn't scream, it pushed harder, until the pressure built inside your chest and the air refused to stay still around you. He described nights where he swore he wasn't alone, though he never saw another figure. Whispers followed him through the trees, branches bent without wind. He would hear the sound of footsteps circling his camp, the scrape of something moving just beyond the reach of his firelight. And then, silence. An unbearable, suffocating silence that pressed in from all sides. But the night that broke him wasn't about what he saw, it was what he heard. He told us he was gathering wood near a dry creek bed when a scream tore through the air. A woman's scream, high-pitched, raw, filled with panic. He froze, heart pounding. He waited for it to repeat, but instead the sound twisted, unraveling in a way no human voice should. For months he lived this way, haunted, worn thin, always on the edge of breaking. When he finally stumbled back into town, he was gaunt, his skin stretched over bone, his eyes hollowed by sleepless nights. He sought out someone, anyone, who would listen. And that's when his story was captured, preserved on tape. But the interview was never finished. He vanished before the second session could take place. No one saw him leave. No one knew where he went. The recording remains, his words frozen in time, his voice warning us of something none of us want to believe. And yet, late at night, when the wind cuts through the trees, some claim they can hear him still, his voice crying out in the distance, tangled with the echoes of others who never made it back. The drifter said the forest feeds on fear. Maybe he was right. Maybe that's why it never lets go of the ones who give it what it craves. And maybe that's why his screams still linger. Not every story of the forest comes from wanderers or curious students. Some of them come from those sworn to protect. One of the most chilling accounts is preserved not in folklore, but in a series of dispatch logs, a 911 recording, and a single damaged dashcam video. It began just after midnight, when the county dispatch received a frantic call. The voice on the other end was breathless, broken by sobs. "We're lost. It's chasing us," the caller cried, the words fractured by the sound of heavy footsteps crunching through leaves. In the background, a second voice screamed, the sound muffled, then distant, as though the caller was already being pulled away. The line went dead. Deputy Mark Hanlon was the first to respond. A veteran of a small sheriff's department, Hanlon was known in town as calm, steady-handed, the sort of man who'd seen enough to keep his nerve when others couldn't. He was also a father of 3, which made what happened that night all the more difficult to accept. When he arrived at the edge of the state forest, his dashcam was already rolling. The footage shows him pulling off onto a dirt road, headlights cutting through the tangle of trees. His voice comes over the radio, steady at first. "Dispatch, I've got no visual yet. Advancing eastbound. Copy?" For several minutes, nothing seems unusual. Just the slow crawl of headlights over roots and branches, the occasional sweep of the forest floor. But then, something changes. At exactly 12:41 a.m., the first scream is captured on the audio. A man's voice, torn with terror, echoing from the trees. Hanlon brakes hard, the dashcam shaking with the sudden stop. He opens his door, steps out into the night, flashlight beam cutting across the road. And that's when the second scream comes. Only, it isn't from one direction. It's from every direction. The dashcam microphone records it clearly. Overlapping cries, rising from the forest around him. High-pitched, low-pitched, some sounding close enough to touch, others distant, swallowed by the woods. It wasn't just one person in danger. It was as though the forest itself had found a way to throw voices, to surround him with panic. Hanlon's breathing quickens. The beam of his flashlight jerks left, then right, as he spins in place. His eyes are wide, his jaw tight, his entire body trembling. The dashcam records him convulsing violently, his hands clutching at the steering wheel as though anchoring himself to reality. And then, he screams. It is not the scream of a deputy in control. It is raw, primal, the kind of sound a man makes when the world he thought he knew has fallen apart around him. His voice merges with the others, indistinguishable from the screams coming from the forest. Seconds later, the recording cuts. Backup arrived 20 minutes after his last transmission. They found him slumped against the wheel, drenched in sweat, still alive but unable or unwilling to speak. His cruiser headlights were still on, cutting through the empty woods. There were no footprints on the road, no sign of the caller who had begged for help. Deputy Hanlon survived that night, but he never spoke another word. Hospital records listed his condition as trauma-induced mutism, a rare state brought on by extreme psychological shock. The doctors said there was no physical injury to his throat, no neurological damage. He simply stopped speaking. To this day, he remains silent. His family communicates with him through notes and gestures, but his voice, the voice that once commanded authority and calm, is gone. All that remains is the recording, archived and locked away, a piece of evidence few are willing to listen to more than once. Because in that static, between the echoes of fear, some swear they can still hear those screams, the ones that surrounded him that night. And the question remains, were they the voices of the lost, or the forest itself, calling out through the mouths it has already taken? Long before rangers kept journals, before dispatch logs and dashcam recordings, the people who lived closest to these woods already knew what waited in the dark. To them, the Echo Pines were never just a stretch of forest. They were a place where the trees themselves seemed to breathe, to remember, and to warn. Among the elders of the nearby community, there is a saying passed from one generation to the next. The pines do not forget. They carry the last sound of a soul. For outsiders, that might sound like poetry. But to those who grew up in the shadow of these trees, it's a warning wrapped in tradition. Stories tell of hunters who never came home, their final cries swallowed by the forest floor, only to be heard again, years later, carried on the wind through the branches. Mothers told their children not to wander too far from campfires because the woods would remember them, not by their names, but by their screams. One elder, interviewed in the 1970s, said something that chills even today. When you hear a scream in the pines, you are not hearing a ghost. You are hearing the tree itself. It has swallowed a voice, and it plays it back so the forest will always remember. And the more the forest remembers, the louder it grows. Link that to what we've already heard in the modern accounts. The vanished campers, the fire lookout who swore the screams were inside his stairwell, the students whose voices echoed back at them, the deputy who joined the chorus against his will, and the pattern is impossible to ignore. It's as if every disappearance, every death, every terrified cry doesn't just end, it lingers. The forest takes it in, like roots drawing water, and then feeds it back when the night is still enough. The science-minded will argue it's acoustics, an echo chamber shaped by ridges and valleys, the perfect geography for sound to stretch and warp. But that doesn't explain why the voices don't fade, why screams first recorded in the 1930s still match the same pitches, the same tones, even decades later. And it doesn't explain why the voices sometimes change. There are witnesses who claim they heard the sound of a loved one crying out, years after their death, in a forest they had never set foot in. Others describe screams that begin in one pitch, only to bend and twist until they are indistinguishable from their own. They are an active presence, something alive in ways we don't fully understand. Every branch and trunk, every needle swaying in the wind, might be carrying with it the memory of the last sound someone made as they slipped from this world. The screams don't die. The trees won't let them. And if the elders are right, then every missing hiker, every ranger who never came back, every cry for help that vanished into static, is still here, still speaking, still caught in the chorus of the pines. So when the night grows quiet, when the air is still, and a sound cuts across the valley like glass tearing through silence, remember, you're not just hearing the past, you're hearing the forest itself. And if you ever feel the urge to call out, to scream back, don't. Because once the pines take your voice, they will never give it back. There are stories that live only in memory, passed from one voice to another, altered as the years wear on. But then there are the stories left behind in evidence, undeniable, documented, preserved. This chapter begins with one of those. The recording was discovered in a ranger station long after the man who made it had passed away. His name was Harold McCready, a ranger who had served the Echo Pines region for nearly 4 decades. By the time his confessions surfaced, he was already gone. A man who had retired quietly, with no family to inherit his belongings. Among the boxes of gear, old maps, and weathered logbooks, A single cassette tape was found, unlabeled, except for the word truth. The voice on the tape is weak, ragged. Age has hollowed it out, and illness drags on each word. Yet there's something steady beneath the rasp, the sound of a man who has carried a burden for far too long. "My name is Harold McCready," the tape begins. "For 37 years I patrolled these woods. I kept fires contained, guided hikers, patched up broken legs, and calmed down more than a few drunks. But there's something I never wrote in the reports. Something I couldn't." He pauses. The sound of labored breathing fills the tape. You can almost hear him wrestling with whether or not to continue. And then he does. "We always called them echoes. That's what people said when they came back shaking. They heard a scream on the wind, and we'd nod, say it was the sound bouncing off the valleys. Harmless. But it isn't. It isn't an echo. It's bait." The words hang there, trembling, weighted by memory. McCready describes a search operation from the early 1960s when a teenager went missing from a campground. The boy's mother swore she could hear him screaming from deep inside the forest, crying for help. McCready and 2 others pushed in, following the sound. Each time they thought they were close, the voice shifted, just out of reach. "We hiked for hours," he says, his voice shaking. "It felt like the forest was pulling us. Always one more ridge, one more clearing. But the voice never got closer. By morning, we realized we'd gone miles off course. When we finally turned back, the boy was gone. We found his body weeks later, wedged between roots like the forest itself. That's when I knew. The screams, they make you chase them. And when you do, you don't come back the same. Sometimes you don't come back at all." McCready claims he saw this pattern repeat over the years. Families who swore they heard their own children calling from the woods. Hikers who insisted their partners were alive and crying out, only for search teams to find no trace. Rangers who went in confident and came out broken, their sanity cracked like glass. And then he admits the part that haunted him the most. "I've heard my own voice out there, calling, crying. I don't know if it's something waiting for me or if the forest already has me. But I know this much. Every scream you hear in those trees was once a real person. Someone like me, someone like you. And when you answer them, you become the next echo." There's a long silence on the tape. Just the sound of the old machine humming, tape rolling. And then, faintly, another sound creeps in. At first it's hard to tell if it's feedback or distortion, but slowly, it sharpens. It's a scream, not a stranger's, not a recording pulled from some long-lost case. It's his, Harold McCready's own voice, tearing into panic, filling the tape with a single unbroken cry of terror. It cuts off abruptly, the recorder snapping to silence. That's where the confession ends. No explanation, no final words. Just the proof of a man who spent his life in the Echo Pines, leaving behind the very thing he feared most. His voice, trapped, joining the chorus. And now, when the wind moves through those trees, locals say they can still pick it out. The scream of the ranger who tried to warn us, echoing forever in the pines. From campers to cops, from students to rangers, the pattern never changes. Their stories are scattered across decades, separated by time, but connected by the same sound. A cry that doesn't fade, a voice that doesn't die. We began with legends, old tales whispered by the people who knew the forest long before park boundaries or ranger stations existed. They said the trees remember the last sound a soul makes before it leaves this world. At first, that sounded like myth, but as you've heard, every case points to the same conclusion. The pines don't just echo, they keep. The family who vanished at their campsite, the lookout whose tower burned with him inside, the students who recorded their own screams hours before they were gone, the drifter who swore the forest feeds on fear, the deputy who walked out but never spoke again, and the old ranger who left us his final confession. Their voices are still here. They carry on the wind, stitched into the very needles of the trees, bending through the valleys like something alive. And so the question is no longer whether these woods hold on to the past. The question is how many voices are still waiting to be heard. The next time you're in a forest and the night falls too fast and the air goes still, listen closely. If you hear it, if you hear that scream cutting across the silence, don't run toward it. Don't even look for it. Because once the pines have your voice, they never give it back. This has been another story from MindFuel, where real horror is unearthed and legends are given breath. If you found yourself leaning closer, holding your breath, waiting for the sound in the silence, then subscribe. There are more voices waiting to be heard, and more forests still to be explored. Until next time, remember this. The screaming doesn't always stop when the night is over. Sometimes, it waits for you. From campers to cops, from students to rangers, the same thread runs through every account. No matter the decade, no matter the witness, the forest does not let their voices go. It carries them, shapes them, binds them into something larger than memory. The echo pines are not just a backdrop for tragedy. They are active, alive, feeding on the last cries of those who entered and never returned. The campers' final panic, the lookout's desperate admission, the students' laughter turned to terror, the deputy's broken scream, the ranger's dying confession. All of them are still here. Locals say if you stand at the tree line on a windless night, you can hear them overlap, like a choir without harmony, each voice trapped in its own endless fear. Some are faint, barely whispers. Others are sharp enough to raise the hairs on your neck, but all of them belong to those who once thought they were safe. And if the elders were right, then the pines are not merely echoing. They are keeping, storing, waiting. The next time you walk into the woods and the silence is broken by a cry you cannot place, remember this. You are not hearing someone in need. You are hearing the forest call. Do not run toward it. Do not even turn your head, because once the pines have your voice, they never give it back. This has been another story from MindFuel, where the echoes of true horror are never far, and the shadows still have more to tell. Subscribe, because the forest remembers, and so do we.